Well, welcome to Dairy Livestream. I'm your host, Corey Geiger, managing editor of Hoards Dairyman. We are broadcasting from the Cheese Cave, our studio in downtown Fort Atkinson at the historic W.D. Hoard & Sons company building commissioned by Wisconsin Governor W.D. Hoard. Our conversation today will focus on the hot topic, is Canada really limiting U.S. dairy sales? That discussion is centered on the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, or what many of us refer to as USMCA, that was ratified last year. For those joining us live, please share with your friends that this webcast will be available on our Hoards Dairyman YouTube channel this Thursday, and on podcasts, it's a podcast version on Spotify and Google Podcasts the very same day. That's right, Dairy Livestream now has podcast versions that you can easily search from for the convenience of your smartphone. While Canada and the United States largely enjoy one of the best border relationships between two countries in the world, dairy has become a contentious issue in recent years. Looking back, nearly 27 years ago when the old North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, took effect, dairy was one of those issues that was largely left on the sidelines, as both Canada and U.S. were most exclusively domestic dairy markets. These days for dairy, Canada remains a domestic dairy market as its supply management system limits milk flow on the supply side. On the flip side, the U.S. dairy community has grown dairy exports to 18% of all milk output, hence the foundation for today's discussion. Given the situation, the new USMCA is really the first version of a dairy agreement between Canada and the U.S. While it's not our goal to iron out the issue as it relates to the U.S. Trade Representative's dispute settlement case launched this May, we want to give everyone a better grasp of the issues faced on both sides of the border. What do we know about dairy as it relates to the USTR? The U.S. exports various dairy products to Canada already, and the new USMCA does not throw the doors open to the Canadian market. It simply expands how much U.S. can ship to Canada by a small amount. The Office of the U.S. Trade Representative has launched a trade dispute settlement because it believes the current volume of dairy trade is lower than what Canada agreed to once the USMCA was fully implemented. What's more, so everyone knows, the volume and value would grow between dairy trade in the ensuing years, so it ratchets up a little bit. In short synopsis, that is where we are today. To say the least, this is a very heated topic on both sides of the border. With that in mind, we appreciate that Mussell has agreed to share a Canadian perspective and that Gregg Doud has agreed to share a U.S. perspective. To knit the conversation together, we're asking the University of Wisconsin's Mark Stephenson to share some opening comments to build upon my remarks. But first, let's go to a poll question. The U.S. has 9.5 million dairy cows as of May. How many dairy cows are in Canada? You could select from one of the following: 480,000, 980,000, 1.48 million, or 2.98 million. So go ahead and answer that question, and we will then turn over to Mark. So we have well over 2/3 voted here, so let's go ahead and cut that poll question off. And the correct answer is 980,000. 980,000 is the number of milking cows in Canada. Let's talk more about the USMCA, which is a multilateral agreement between multiple countries, in this case, Canada, the United States, and Mexico. Mark, this agreement goes far beyond dairy. Welcome to Dairy Livestream. Mark, can you tell us more?
Well, I'd be happy to, Corey. And I thought that maybe I'd back up just a little bit and say that, really up until about World War I, world trade was actually quite free and unrestricted. But over the next 30 years after World War I, it became increasingly restrictive as countries began to adopt some protectionist policies. After World War II was settled, it was felt that we needed to address the world trade issue. And in 1947, the first round of what became known as the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade was concluded between 23 countries. So that GATT back in 1947 was actually the first big multilateral trade agreement that, is of the modern day. There were several more rounds of multilateral agreements that were negotiated. And the eighth round in 1986 was known as the Uruguay round. That was because that was where the discussions were first started and launched. And it was really the Reagan administration who was trying to end what they viewed as being protectionist policies at that point in time. That treaty concluded with about 110 countries and was signed. I think it was 110, more than 100 at any rate. Uruguay was also the very first round of the GATT agreements to include agricultural products. Subsequently, following that Uruguay round, we began negotiating another round that was known as the Doha round. And I think that started in 2000 or 2001. It never reached a conclusion. It was a very large document. Multilateral treaties are incredibly difficult and complex, and they take years to complete. But one thing that did follow the Uruguay round was that the World Trade Organization, or WTO, became a formal organization to provide a framework for adjudication of GATT treaties and other administrative services. And actually, you weren't quite right, I think, when you talked about having no dairy treaty with Canada, because the Uruguay round did include that. So if you do go back to the 1986 time period, there was a basis for trade between U.S. and Canada and many other countries for dairy products. But when we did negotiate NAFTA, we did not include dairy trade in that for Canada. We did with Mexico. Subsequently, Mexico has become the largest trading partner that we have for dairy products. So that's grown a great deal. And Canada did opt out, I think, because the threat that it imposed to their quota-based system up there. Perfectly understandable from their perspective. An irritation for U.S. dairy that was growing and saw them as a potential customer. The Trump administration wanted to renegotiate NAFTA, and it was concluded and implemented on July 1st last year, 2020. And that did include dairy in that for trade between Canada and the U.S. When governments are negotiating things like these trade agreements, they have to consider the whole, not just the part. So, for instance, dairy interests don't get to stand on their own to negotiate the terms of trade. Governments have to consider the greatest benefit to their countries, even if it means that some segments may not be quite as well off. So, for instance, Canada doesn't want to provide access to dairy markets because that threatens the quota system. But their lumber industry wants to sell plywood to the U.S., and it might be acceptable in greater good to have the U.S. give up some of the potential for our lumber prices and sales here by importing from Canada, and Canada may be better off in whole by accepting some dairy products from the U.S. Any industry is going to tend to capitalize value into the most constrained resource. So for example, New Zealand is very land constrained, and the land value in New Zealand has climbed from about $5,000 per hectare in the 1970s to about $40,000 per hectare today. Huge increase. It's very constrained. Dairy cows were in short supply in the U.S. 15 years ago or so. Those prices got quite high. Now we've got surplus of animals, and they are not as high as they were back then. Quota in Canada was a most constrained object for dairy producers. It was freely given, but those pieces of paper have created value on farm balance sheets as they've been traded quite freely. Depends on the province, but I think it's somewhere between $25,000 to $40,000 roughly per cow per year. It's actually based on the amount of kilograms of butter fat that are sold per day. But free trade in dairy threatens the net worth of Canadian dairy farmers. So not surprisingly, they're opposed to a lot of additional dairy products coming up from the U.S. In 2014, the medical community declared a truce on animal fats. Time magazine on their cover said, "Eat butter." And, the U.S. and Canadians embraced that. we had a real surge in demand, and we met that demand for butterfat here in the U.S. by increasing milk production. But of course, with increased milk production and butterfat, we got the residual non-fat solids that came along with that. And we've had to find world markets to help absorb most of those skim milk solids. And we're now one of the largest exporters of skim milk powder in the world to balance the components. Canada could have met their additional demand for butterfat at that time by either importing it from the US or other countries, or by increasing milk production like we did. And in fact, quota allocation was increased over a 2 or 3 year time period. If Al, you're going to have to correct me if I'm wrong, by about something like 80 million kilograms of butterfat a day over a 2 or 3 year time period. It fluctuates a little bit from one year to the next, but nevertheless, a fair amount of quota was again allocated. And when that satisfied the butterfat demand, it also left surplus non-fat solids for Canada to deal with. And that, I think, gets down to some of the crux of what it is we're disputing. You have to think about these things in the whole. They become complicated. So the issues are not straightforward. But, with that, I think maybe we can get into some of the issues as seen from both countries' borders.
Thank you very much, Mark. I appreciate that good knitting together. As a reminder to our audience, if questions come to you when you hear our panelists, please submit them when you go to webinar control panel. And the earlier you ask the question, the more likely we'll ask it on the air here. So we're going to go to another poll question before we hear from Gregg Doud. What commodity has become the first trade panel inquest under the new USMCA? And so this one should be a quick and easy hit here. So we'll give everybody about 10 seconds to do that one. And we got votes flying in here rather fast. And the correct answer, of course, is dairy. And so it's fair to say, I think here, without getting into too much politics, that the Biden administration doesn't always agree with the Trump administration. However, what we've seen here from the American standpoint is both administrations have come to a similar conclusion that they feel Canada isn't living up to the dairy terms of the USMCA. Hence, the dispute settlement inquiry this May from the current U.S. Trade Representative, Catherine Tai. Gregg Doud joins us next. These days, he's Vice President of Global Situational Awareness and Chief Economist for Aimpoint Research. From May 2018 to January 2021, Gregg served as the Chief Agricultural Negotiator under the U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer. Prior to that, Gregg was President of the Commodity Markets Council, a senior staff member of the Senate Agricultural Committee, and prior to that, Chief Economist for the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. To say the least, dairy is a complicated matter. Gregg, can you share your perspective on this, the USMCA as it relates to dairy?
Well, Corey, I would be happy to, and thanks for having me. And I first of all want to note that I'm back in the private sector. I'm no longer a government official, although I've been in Washington all these years. People think that I'm a bureaucrat. I admit I've lived in Washington for 29 years, which means I'm of little to no value to anybody in the outside world for any longer, but only 5 of that was in government. And interestingly enough, as we're having this conversation, I'm just outside of Lambeau Field in Green Bay, getting ready to conduct a war game with a section of the U.S. dairy industry. And this is a pretty interesting thing with Aimpoint these days. 2 of my colleagues are the 2 most recent colonels in charge of wargaming for the Army War College of the United States. And their boss, all 3 of these guys, were classmates at West Point. And they have taken this type of approach that they used in the U.S. military and brought it to corporate America now to help stress test strategic plans, think, and what we do at Aimpoint is do a lot of intel and thinking about 5, 10, 20 years ahead. And I think that's something we need to focus on in today in this discussion as much or more than we do about the history of all of this. And the reason I think that is because, in the U.S.-Canada trade agreement of 1988 and NAFTA, the U.S. dairy industry was far different than it is today, quite frankly. It's as you noted at the top, Corey, the amount of U.S. dairy products that are exported around the world has grown by leaps and bounds since NAFTA, which was, a long time, over 25 years ago. The global industry for dairy has changed. Our ability to move dairy products around the world has changed. And as has rightly been indicated, there wasn't a huge need to include dairy in NAFTA 26 years ago. But in this latest iteration of this and the opportunity to have this conversation in USMCA on the U.S. side, this was a very important topic of conversation that needed to be held. And I think the biggest reason for that was, as Mark rightly noted, the changes in demand for the different components around the world for dairy. Huge increase in demand for fat and butter fat and those kinds of products in the U.S. and Canada and around the world. That's a big change from years ago. And as a result of that, it has caused some difficulty for Canada's supply management and some frustration in the U.S. And I think that's what we tried to tackle in our negotiations between the U.S. and Canada this time around. Were we successful or not? I don't know. This was the first time that we've had a chance to have a conversation with Canada about that. And I now, looking at this and having worked on trade deals for a big chunk of my career, the answer is, for everybody in the audience, from my perspective and doing this for a long time, how long does it take before you know whether you got it right or not in a negotiation like this? In my estimation, it's about 10 years. It takes a long time before you know whether you got it right or not and what mistakes you may or may not have made. You don't really know at this point in the process. What we did know with Canada, and in terms of its tariff rate quota administration, is that there have always been difficulties with Canada and tariff rate quota administration and how they administer their own TRQs and how they import products. This dispute, the first enforcement mechanism at with a USMCA agreement, is really interesting because it boils down to one sentence, I think, essentially, and the interpretation of that sentence, which is a legal matter. From my perspective, I don't know about how this, it's for lawyers to decide. I will say this, though. We knew with the NAFTA dispute mechanism and having been involved in that in one of those with Mexico, the mechanism just didn't work. It was not something that could be utilized in a way to solve or sort something out. So that was a big push here with USMCA, is let's try to create a mechanism when we have a situation where we have a disagreement, that we can work this out in short order, relatively speaking, and come to some sort of conclusion in a much different fashion than we do with the WTO or historically with NAFTA. And so from my perspective, we all understand the importance of getting this relationship right between the U.S. and Canada and dairy. But to me, almost more important is whether this dispute mechanism is going to work. This is going to be an interesting test and an important test in a 21st century, and from the U.S. perspective, what we would call is a gold standard agreement. This is the best deal we've ever come up with USMCA and any countries. This is a 21st century agreement. Hopefully, we can figure out a way and a mechanism to sort this out and deal with this. And so I think that's the perspective that I would like to start with everybody in this discussion this afternoon.
Well, thank you very much, Gregg. And specifically to your opening comments, I'm sure you're getting a lot of traction in your current role with strategic planning. I mean, you're talking long term, but even in the short term, what we all dealt with the pandemic and how quickly our industry was resilient. We saw milk getting dumped about 2.5% nationally. And if you look at the federal order statistics, and then the industry really coalesced by thanks to some government intervention too, that went away real quick in May. So long-term planning and long-term approach is very important. With that, we are going to have our third poll question here before we hear from Al Mussell. He's going to talk a little bit about this. In Canada, who initiates dairy trade? Your choices are Canadian importers of record, U.S. exporters of record, all of the above, and none of the above. So those are your answers. We're going to leave that one on the screen a little bit here because I think it's an important part of our discussion today, and especially as it relates to this dispute that we're now talking about. So as people are digesting that one, we'll continue on. I'll remind people to go ahead and ask questions in our GoToWebinar control panel as you hear them from our audience on the USMCA trade agreement and as it relates to dairy. So let's go ahead and cut that poll question out. And so 31% said Canadian importers of record, 42% said all of the above, and 22% said none of the above. So Al, you're going to have some good starting this conversation here. And we always have a dress rehearsal the day before, and the correct answer is Canadian importers of record. There's always two sides of every issue, and I appreciate that Al has agreed to be with us today. As a Canadian citizen, Al has a unique perspective, having earned degrees in both Canada and the United States. His first studies took him to the University of Guelph, and later he went to the University of Minnesota, where he earned a PhD in agricultural economics. Al then started his career working for Land O'Lakes Cooperative as an economist in milk procurement. He then returned to his native country, serving as senior research associate for the George Morris Center. 6 years ago, Al founded Agri-Food Economic Systems, where he specializes in agricultural marketing and agricultural policy. Al is the past president of the Canadian Agricultural Economics Society. Al, can you share your perspective on this dairy dust-up between two good neighbors?
Sure, please do that, Corey, and thanks very much for the invitation. Pleased to offer some thoughts on this topic based on my work as a researcher. I guess first, I think it's really unfortunate that this matter has been elevated to a formal dispute. This is not the way we'd like to start our trade policy relationship with the new U.S. administration and the new U.S. trade representative. Now, as Canadians, I think we struggle to understand exactly what the U.S. objects to in this dispute. The U.S. Trade Representative website tells us that the U.S. is challenging Canada's allocation of dairy tariff rate quotas, specifically the set-aside percentage of each dairy TRQ exclusively for Canadian processors. These measures deny the ability of U.S. dairy farmers, workers, and exporters to utilize the TRQs to realize the full benefit of USMCA. So that's from the U.S. Trade Representative's website. Let me explain in my understanding of how the allocation of TRQs work. First, as per the poll question, the allocation of the Canadian import permits under tariff rate quotas is to Canadian residents. Secondly, the allocation of TRQs is to importers of record, typically dairy processors and trading companies, brokers, and other types of organizations like that. Canadian imports within permitted levels are initiated by Canadian firms holding import permits. They are not initiated by exporters, as per the poll question. Now, this approach to the allocation of dairy TRQs, and especially the allocation of import permits to Canadians, is long-standing. In particular, this is the approach that was used in the implementation of the CPTPP agreement that came into force as the USMCA was being negotiated. So each of Mexico and the US were aware of Canada's established approach to TRQ administration. And there's nothing in the USMCA to suggest that Canada was required to change those arrangements. Now, as many on the call will be aware, farm milk prices are lower in the US than they are in Canada. And the dairy processing technology is essentially the same in both countries. So on a cost basis, you would expect the product could move from the US to Canada and the TRQs would be filled just based on market arbitrage. And, you know, for example, the trade agreement that Canada has with the European Union, I looked at it for 2020, 96% of the cheese TRQ was filled. And then we also have a portion of the global tariff rate quota that's open to all countries that's actually designated to the EU. And in that part of it, 98% was filled. However, it took time to get to this level of trading relationship with the European Union, even though the EU is an established supplier of cheese imports to Canada. And initially, in the trade agreement we have with the EU, it appeared that the TRQ fill rates might actually be low, so it took time. More generally, a recent study by the USDA Economic Research Service reported that in 2014-15, the overall fill rate of these tariff rate quotas on agri-food products across countries is only 56%. Only 40% of the tariff rate quotas had imports that exceeded 80% fill rate. 36% of the TRQs only had fill rates of 20%. So the message seems to be that it takes time and effort to get these TRQ arrangements to work, even when you might think that price or market arbitrage would have this take care of itself. But supply and demand in importing countries is also an important consideration. Now, I did take a look at USMCA and fill rates for a range of dairy products, not all of them, because there's a laundry list of them, for 2020. And I guess what I saw was really a range of results. So some of the TRQ fill rates are really quite high. I've got here cheese of all types, the fill rate was 93%. Products and natural milk constituents, the fill rate was also 93%. Cream, the fill rate was 85%. So, almost 100% for those products. Some of the other ones are lower. Industrial cheese, 48%. Butter and cream powder, 66%. Yogurt and buttermilk, 34%. When you get down to skim milk powder, it's only 14%. It's a low fill rate. Well, how do we understand the variance in the fill rates? Well, the USMCA came into force on July 1st, 2020, almost exactly a year ago. Because it fell during the year, the TRQ volumes intended for year one needed to be prorated for the proportion of the year remaining in 2020. So that's the first issue. The situation was protracted for products with TRQ access operating on a Canadian dairy year, which runs from August 1st to July 31st. So what that meant was that effectively the 2020 year for TRQ purposes was squeezed into the month of July 2020. Surely the market and the logistical disruptions of the pandemic played a role in this, and it probably limited what was possible in year one. And also there was a delay in establishing the quotas and allocation until just before coming forth into the agreement, which must have exacerbated matters. So I think it was round about end of April or early May 2020 before we determined it was going to come into force on July 1st. So that was bad. The supply and demand situation in Canada varies. It matters very much in terms of influencing trade, even within the TRQ volume. The extremes are represented by cheese and skim milk powder, as I mentioned before. On cheese, the Canadian market is growing rapidly and perhaps faster than the domestic production can serve to keep up with it, and imports are actually in high demand to help fill that gap. Conversely, skim milk powder is not demanded, and Canada, like other countries, and as Mark made reference to, has struggled with surpluses. The demand for dairy imports within TRQ permit levels is heavily influenced by the demands of Canadian processors. Now, that's an outcome of market organization in Canada. Dairy processing has become highly concentrated and processors have expanded aggressively. And as this has occurred, the dairy processors have become the dominant importers of record to a large degree. The USMCA provides some detail on the expectations for administration and allocation of these tariff rate quotas. Like the CPTPP text, the USMCA states that allocating the TRQs, the party administering the TRQ allocation mechanisms shall not discriminate against new importers when allocating the TRQ. Well, as far as I know, the meaning of this is unclear, as non-discrimination against new importers does not imply that allocations must be given to new importers. The USMCA text also sets out some specific shares of TRQs to go to Canadian processors, notably for milk and cream. The agreement is also supposed to facilitate the filling of importer requests for tariff rate quotas. This demands an allocation mechanism that's more refined than first come, first served, and I think this is precisely what Canada has done. The agreement text also says that the allocation of TRQ is not supposed to go to producers, but it seems like now through this litigation, the TRQ is not supposed to go to processors, and we're really not sure how that can be the case. Canadian and U.S. procedures for TRQ administration in dairy products are actually remarkably similar. U.S. importers using TRQ must have a license. In order to qualify for a license, an applicant must be a U.S. company, and eligibility is determined by the applicant's import history, such as the number of shipments and the volume of those shipments during the past year. As the U.S. dairy industry has evolved, today it has a major interest as a dairy exporter, as was mentioned a few moments earlier. Canada's milk marketing system, which has quite a number of distinct similarities to U.S. milk marketing, is predicated on supplying the domestic market. While it is painful, Canada has committed to increased access for dairy imports from the U.S., the European Union, and the CPTPP countries. In my understanding of it, given time for market connections and commercial relationships to more fully develop, and a better understanding of relative supply and demand balance, the fill rates established under the USMCA will broadly increase, consistent with the intent and letter of the USMCA. However, from my perspective as an agricultural researcher, I see nothing in this agreement that's adverse to Canada's current dairy import practices.
Thank you, Al. So we're in the second half of the program here now. We're going to take questions from the audience, and there's a number of thoughtful questions in here. I'm going to give the first question to Mark, and Al probably can add the Canadian's perspective here, but I think our audience wants to understand, and so I'm going to ask you the U.S. question, Mark, and I'm going to give Al the Canadian one. How much of U.S. dairy product consumption is satisfied by U.S. dairy production? So really, how much is domestic supply and how much do we import from other countries? So then, Al, the question for you is going to be, how much of Canadian dairy product consumption is satisfied by Canadian dairy production, and how much are you importing from other countries? Try to put it just on a percentage basis. We don't need that, the pounds and all that, or kilograms. Mark?
Well, in the U.S., we are exporting somewhere between 15 and 18% of our milk production. Most of that as skim milk solids, but occasionally we have an opportunity for butter, cheese products, something that's a little higher butter fat. But mostly it's going to be skim milk powder or it's whey powders. And on the import side, we import somewhere between 3 to 4% of our milk production. So, we're net exporters, but we still import some products. It used to be a little higher than that, but it has decreased over the last couple of decades.
And from my understanding, most of that imported product in the U.S. is largely cheese, some butter. Is that accurate, Mark?
It is, and we again used to import quite a lot of cheeses, high-value cheeses that weren't necessarily made here in this country. And again, over the last 20 years, we've been producing more and more of those specialty cheese products, and that's kind of been a displacement to a lot of the imports that we used to take in.
Okay. And Al, so the same question for you, but a Canadian's perspective. How much Canadian dairy product consumption is satisfied by Canadian dairy farms, really, and what percent are you importing from other countries?
So Curry, you sent me scrambling there momentarily to look in databases or old presentations to see if I had that number on a kind of a butterfat or milk equivalent basis, and I don't have it. Canada's going to be served to a greater extent by imports than the U.S. is in general, and particularly it's going to be in that cheese category, as Mark made reference to. Particularly the European cheese, and a lot of them are European origin.
Well, thank you. And for our sake of our audience here, I always try to bring everybody up to speed on the journey on the acronyms. So there was an acronym that Al was throwing out there that I'm going to get it right. CPTPP. What does that mean? That's the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. So at one time, the U.S. was involved in that negotiations. We decided to be on the sideline, but about everybody else forged ahead. So that's what he was talking about there. Gregg, we're going to come back here on a question here. As Al talked a little bit about the Canadian perspective, I think you having had past experience in the U.S. Trade Representative Office, so the U.S. has brought and this is from my perspective, a formal legal case that we're talking about here. But do you know of any time that the USTR has brought a legal case, or what's their track record on bringing these forward? what has been the resolution? From what I understand, it has been rather high as it goes through that journey. What can you tell us about that?
That's a great question, Corey, and it's actually a frustration for me, and in that historically, USTR doesn't like to bring a dispute unless they're about 200% sure that they're going to win. We would, in agriculture in particular, we'd like to see a few more of these. We'd like to get them down to, just 108, 9, 10% sure you're going to win and still bring the case. It doesn't have to be 200. I'm being facetious here a little bit of the fact that they don't bring a case unless they are lead pipe sure that they're going to win the thing. And their track record is, I don't know if it's 100%, but it probably is pretty close in agriculture to winning the case. And I do want to comment here while I've got an opportunity to dial in and help folks understand this dispute a little bit. Al, you made some great comments and kind of laying it out. And so let me see if I can do it in Kansas Farm Boy terminology here. What's really going on is the fact that what the U.S. is trying to say with Canada is you can't allocate your tariff rate quota to an entity who knowingly won't use it. That's really the frustration. And so when Al says that we have a TRQ allocation system that is, I think I wrote down what he said here is, quote, more refined than first come, first serve. That's some interesting language that I noted here as I would in my former job. And then Al also said, well, we the United States perspective is, well, if you allocate it to producers in Canada, the likelihood that TRQ will be utilized is actually quite low. And so that really gets down to the crux of the discussion here to help the folks watching this understand. And again, to my perspective, it's this is now as part of an enforcement mechanism, and we'll see how it all gets sorted out.
So, Corey, could I just make a comment on that? I'm not sure, Greg, how we know that you allocate tariff rate quotas to importers of record. Canada does that. So does the United States. I'm not sure how we know that they knowingly won't use it. And as I mentioned, look, it's not as you know, there's a laundry list of these HS codes that go into the various and sundry dairy products. So I think I had 6 or 7 of them, maybe something like that. But a good share of them are filled quite well. And that's because we're short cheese. And frankly, I don't know if we got enough cheese plants in Canada to keep up with the growth in cheese demand. So we're going to need those imports. We don't need much in the way of powder. We're long powder. So I'm not sure how we can say, sort of as an umbrella statement, allocating TRQs to an entity that won't use them, because some of them are used.
I'm not saying that you are absolutely correct. So the question really comes down to your more refined process as opposed to the U.S. first come first serve process, and versus what the language in the agreement of what we agreed to do. And so again,
but I don't think the U.S. process is. I don't think the U.S. process is first come first serve. And the problem you have with first come first serve is, first guy to the table can take all of it. Well, if we're trying to satisfy as many of these customer demands as there are, and that's what the text of the agreement says, and you're quite familiar with it, I'm sure. Well, first come first serve isn't going to work. They're going to have some mechanism of dealing with all the various and sundry demands that are placed on it, and the way we've done it is allocated through the importers of record, and as far as I understand it, that's how the U.S. does as well. Makes sense.
We have a.
I'm not going to. It does no good to debate with me on all of this because I'm not a lawyer and I'm not a USTR enforcement attorney.
Well, thank you. I think one of the other things here that if my memory is right, and maybe Mark can lead out with this one, and then Gregg and Al join in. So we're talking about this U.S. trade dispute here between that was initiated from the U.S. to Canada. But in that trade agreement and in other trade agreements that Canada has negotiated, there's this word that pops up called geographical indications, and there's probably more commonality on this specific issue than any other. And a lot of people throw out the word GIs when we talk about geographical indications, but our friends in Europe have largely been deploying this strategy as a way to say, if I want a geographical indication, could be Washington apples, could be Idaho potatoes, but some of them have been probably extended well past that to cheese names, for example, that have been around for centuries. So the question that comes in from an audience member, and Mark, you can tackle this first. What is the U.S. doing to protect common dairy product names or geographic indications? And how about Canada as well in these trade agreements? Because some of them that actually got negotiated with the European Union and the Canada, there were a couple that were put in that agreement. So Mark, why don't you tackle that one first?
Well, I'd be happy to. I mean, in the trade negotiations, very early on, when we started, not we, I mean, collectively, the world started to have these restrictions on trade. They were simply quantity based. They said you can't import any more than so many kilograms of a product X, or so many numbers of units. And then we began to move toward tariff rate quotas. In other words, this was something that we could ratchet down more easily by reducing the value of the tariff on products that were imported. It wasn't going to all be hard quantity numbers. But then, of course, you find that you've got creative people and you begin to think a little bit more about non-tariff barriers to trade. That can include things like geographic indicators, that would simply say that you in country X can't build a circular saw and call it a skilled saw because skill saw owns that kind of trade name. The same thing can be true for products, or we're trying to do that with products that have been produced and commonly called something like Parmesan cheese. And we also have trade barriers that can get down to sanitary and phytosanitary standards. Now, all of these things can be barriers to trade that are non-tariff. And I think that, these are the things we begin to fight about when we start to have more nuanced trade issues. And this is one of the reasons that these become more and more complicated, and you need to have an adjudication process to kind of solve some of these things, as Gregg pointed out.
Corey, the answer is this is just straight up protectionism by the Europeans. It's nothing new. It's what they do. We've tried to now address this. We addressed it with a specific letter with Mexico. We addressed it with I believe with a specific letter with Japan in our bilateral deal with them on this. And I think the Canadian, I don't know, but I assume the Canadians have equal amount of frustration on this topic as well. And it's just, it's the way of the West, and the Europeans are always going to find a new way to, keep us out of Europe and cross us up in third country markets. Al, wouldn't you agree with that?
I think, Gregg, in my understanding, but I think this goes back to Champagne, doesn't it? Probably where it started.
Yeah, but
some years ago, and I think did we not? Memory serves me correctly, we actually got a codex standard on that. Look, the reality is in some dairy products, deli meats, obviously wine, some liqueurs and so on, some of the great brands or categories we have they come from Europe. They originate from Europe, and sure, it's in the European interest to leverage that every bit. And I think some of them are maybe intuitive. You got a Spanish ham that is prepared and aged in specifically a particular way, and that maybe we can understand that a little bit. But yeah, when a particular place like Parma decides they own absolutely. It's really a process, not a location. But anyway, it's in their interest to make that case.
So here's another, we're getting some really thoughtful questions in here from the audience. And this one's a little long, so I'm going to edit it on the fly. But we don't want to go through all the TRQs, the tariff rate quotas, but there's categories in dairy, and I think there's over 20 of them, if my understanding of the language is. But the question comes in, do Canadian processors importing products tend to import bulk, lower value products compared to what Canadian retailers or food service providers would import? For example, would bulk cheeses versus specialty or artisanal cheeses likely be more, well, anyway, that's the question there. So what is in this journey here on this discussion, what has been some of the larger products going from the US to Canada? And I think probably what we need to weave in there's really two parts of this. There's some products that go to Canada, and maybe we'll start with this with Mark, maybe he tackles this first. There's some products going to Canada that are destined to be eaten by consumers in Canada. But then there's another category here, and I know this happens, where a dairy product, we have a lot of exports going back and forth. Sometimes there's raw milk going up and coming back across the border as a finished product in it's called a duty drawback program. So maybe unravel these two things here for us, Mark, and then we'll bring Greg and Alan. That some of this is product destined for consumers, and some of this is back and forth trade between processors, really.
Well, if you have a restriction, whether it's by edict or quota, or whether it is by resources available, and a company or country wants more of a given product, then they would try to source that either as finished product, or if they've got processors that would like to produce the product as ingredients. We had a good example of that a few years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, when we kind of slipped a puck past the goalie up there, because in the World Trade Organization, the last GATT agreement, we didn't have a product that was micro filtered milk or ultra filtered milk. And that tanker load showed up at the border, and customs looked at that and said, well, yeah, it's not on a restricted list, go ahead. Well, turns out that you can make cheese from these products, and that begins to threaten, the milk supply of a regulated system like it is. So something needed to be done from the Canadian perspective to slow or stop that down. Understood. That was a product that wasn't on the restricted list. Well, now we're negotiating, and 10, 15 years from now, there'll be some other process that we can go through that will make another product that's not on today's list. So at some point in time, science find a way to get around this, and it's going to be an issue going forward, I'm sure.
Al or Greg, would you like to add on that? And really, probably the original question is, what are some of the major products that are going in? Is it different from a processor versus a retailer?
Sure, I can offer some thoughts on that, Corey. First of all, there's a mix. Mark made reference to milk protein isolates, milk protein concentrates, which are a kind of ultrafiltration product. Didn't exist when a lot of our trade rules were drawn up. That's an ingredient. In general, a Canadian importer is going to look at what they believe they can market most profitably in the Canadian market. And thinking about processors, there are some, say on cheese, some varieties of cheese they think they can import elsewhere, and either it's better quality or more profitable for them than if they made it themselves out of their Canadian operations, and they'll do that. And in other cases, it's ingredients. There's one point in particular I wanted to pick up on, and Corey, you made reference to this. This is bulk milk that goes north of the border and then comes back to the U.S. Now, you need to understand a little bit about this. as probably many people on the call know, we've got states enforce a federal reg, which is called the Pasteurized Milk Ordinance, and it requires a wide range of dairy products. There's a few exceptions. Cheese is an exception. I believe ice cream is an exception. There may be a couple of others, but it requires U.S. grade A standard to manufacture that product. Well, the U.S. has been unable or unwilling to negotiate equivalency agreements with other countries on grade A standards for milk. So, for example, where I live in the province of Ontario, we've got a grade A standard for milk. And in my experience in milk procurement in the U.S., it's not different, really. But if you wanted to sell, a product that falls on that grade A list and export it into the U.S., assuming you get the pricing on it, which would be difficult enough to begin with, but if you could get that, then you would have to have FDA authorized inspectors come up, and they'd have to inspect the plant for U.S. grade A standard. They'd have to inspect the truck. They'd have to go to the farm and inspect the bulk tank. And if you've seen the document, you know what it looks like. They'll go out and they'll measure the width of the stalls and slope of the floor in the barn too. So it's prohibitive. So what you get is, it sounds crazy, but you get bulk loads of milk, bulk loads of cream that come up to plants in Canada. They will manufacture cottage cheese or something like that is one of the ones that comes to mind, and then they export it back to the U.S. But that grade A, that U.S. grade A standard in the pasteurized milk ordinance, that's a long-standing trade irritant. And we've kind of chosen to keep quiet about it out of sort of concern for the greater good, but it's a problem. There's no question about it. Canada was given access to the United States and TRQs under the USMCA agreement, and I can't see how we'll ever fill them, because you'd have to bring up, years ago when we had a brief export business, I remember there's somebody who paid New York State inspectors to come up that would inspect to an FDA standard. And they came up to farms, they inspected trucks and the whole deal, and at great expense. That's what you'd have to do. And of course, our system's a pooled system. And I don't mean just revenue pooled, it's milk pooled too. So I don't know how it'd ever work.
Corey, one quick point I will make is you've got the economics of this, but I think people also have to be reminded that you have different processing on different sides of the border in different regions between the U.S. and Canada. So what you have going on in, say, New York State or Vermont versus what you have going on in Wisconsin versus what you might have going on out west, and what it is today versus what it'll be 5 or 10 years from now. The point is the economics should drive that based upon, whatever the processing is going forward. So from my perspective, I want to look, I appreciate Al's comments about the grade A. I'm not going to get into that debate with him. FDA is an interesting group. I'm just going to leave it at that. But looking forward, the question is do we have the tools in place for this to work in terms of the relationship in dairy between the U.S. and Canada regionally on both sides of the border as best we can?
Mm-hmm. And the industries are so different. I mean, as a person who's been on dairy farms in 46 states, and I think every Canadian province that has a dairy cow, Ontario and Quebec are a lot more alike than the Western Prairie provinces over by the Pacific Ocean. So, and we could say the same things about a lot of the U.S. dairy industry. We have another gentleman on here, and I think this is such a basic question, and I should have almost started with it, but it just came in. Just so that viewers can understand this, how does a Canadian retailer who wants to contract directly with a U.S. cheese manufacturer for retail cheese access quota license? How does that work? If you're a Canadian retailer wants to contract with a U.S. cheesemaker, how does that go about? Is someone willing to tackle that one in a very simple way?
It's a technical question. I'll take a run at it as best I can. What you're going to do is you're going to go to a TRQ quota holder, and you're going to ask them to import a product on your behalf. And I assume there's probably a fee for that, or it could be, but anyway, I think that's how you proceed with it.
Yeah, the challenge with that is if you're new it's how to get your hands on that. And then if the TRQ is owned by, for the sake of argument, a producer, how do you get the producer to do that on behalf of the retailer?
Yeah, but the producers don't own any TRQ. They can't. Straight in the text of the agreement, Greg. Can't happen.
Okay. Well, I thought we fixed that. So that used to be that way. Hopefully, we fixed that. So that's the case going forward.
No, but it's right in the text of the agreement.
Mm-hmm.
Pull it out.
We're approaching
It's
the top of
supposed to be. Let's put it. It's supposed to be that way. We'll put it that way.
We're approaching the top of the hour. And one of the things Mark can probably speak to real quickly, though, but when we're talking TRQs, which is really dairy product trade between Canada and U.S., the products that don't count in that, though, are these bulk shipments back and forth that are turned into products. Is that not correct?
Yes, that's correct. They obviously have to be identified and tracked, but yes, they can be transformed in Canada and, value added and brought back down.
So with that, we're approaching the top of the hour here, and our next dairy live stream will focus on new tools to breed more profitable cows. The conversation will focus on the latest advancements in dairy cattle breeding and the new net merit formula, which will debut in August. The formula will feature the latest groundbreaking research on feed efficiency. The show will air next week on Wednesday, July 7th, 2021 at 11 a.m. Central Standard Time, and again will be archived on the Hoards Dairyman YouTube channel and our podcast channels the very next day. We look forward to seeing you then. On behalf of Gregg Doud, Al Mussell, and Mark Stephenson, I'm Corey Geiger, your host. Thank you for joining us today. We wish you all a good day. Thank you, everyone.